Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, JSSJ. If you're passionate about justice, equity, and inclusion, and you're looking for a distinctly Jewish lens, USF's graduate-level JSSJ certificate program offers a powerful opportunity to grow your impact and deepen your practice. This summer, dive into disability and Jewish social justice with none other than Julia Watts-Belzer, author, advocate, and past Judaism Unbound guest, exploring how we build truly accessible, inclusive communities rooted in Jewish values. Applications are open now through May 27th. Learn more and apply at usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 483, Heeb Media. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And you can think of today's episode as a kind of Back to the Future episode, since we're talking with two people, Mick Moore and Libby Lenkinski, who are among the leaders of a group working to revive a beloved blast from the relatively recent Jewish past, Heeb magazine, which was a fixture of the early 2000s Jewish media scene. Under their leadership, Heeb magazine is now Heeb Media, which will hopefully become a fixture of the 2020s scene and beyond. Heeb Media plans to feature original audio, video, and writing, an unparalleled online store, and in-person events to showcase artists and build community, all from a deeply Jewish and deeply subversive perspective. Some of you will remember Heeb fondly, and for others of you, this might be the first you've ever heard of it. No matter where you are in that spectrum, you'll want to check out heebmedia.com, where you can dive into what Heeb once was and get an early sense of where it will be going in the future. Before we dive into our conversation, just a couple of brief announcements. First, we're very excited to be opening applications for our third cohort in the Unyeshiva's certificate program in Unbound Judaism. You can learn more at judaismunbound.com/certificate. If you're looking for a program where you can immerse deeply in Jewish learning and unlearning from anywhere in the world and as part of a community of wildly creative people, this certificate program could be the perfect fit for you. You can fill out an initial info form at judaismunbound.com/certificate and then download all the application materials. Also, don't forget to register for Shavuot Live, our annual 24-hour extravaganza diving into Torah broadly defined, which is going to be taking place from the evening of May 31st into the evening of June 1st. You can sign up for that by heading over to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, that's SHAVUOT. Come learn with leading luminaries like Arthur Waskow, Danya Ruttenberg, amazing Unyeshiva teachers like Kishira Halev Fife and Barbara Tita, and of course, people like us, Miriam Turlinchamp, Lex, me, other members of the Judaism Unbound team. So again, that's judaismunbound.com/Shavuot to register. And now a bit about our guest today. Our first guest, Mick Moore, is president of Heeb Media. He is also the CEO and founder of Moore & Associates, a creative agency in New York City. Mick Moore co-founded Schlep Labs, the pro-Obama super PAC, responsible for many of the most viral videos of the 2008, 2012, and 2016 campaigns, including The Great Schlep with Sarah Silverman and Wake the Fuck Up with Samuel L. Jackson. In 2019, Moore & Associates joined the Center for Media and Social Impact to launch the Yes and Laughter Lab. Mick Moore and his work have been featured in The New York Times, Hardball with Chris Matthews, NPR, The Washington Post, CNN, The Forward, and many other media outlets. Mick Moore holds a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center and a BA in history from Vassar College. Our second guest, Libby Lenkinski, is the treasurer of Heeb Media's board of directors. She is also founding president of Albi, a new fund, institute, and lab that uses cultural vehicles to establish paradigm-shifting narratives by and about Palestinians and Jews, and she serves as vice president for public engagement at the New Israel Fund, where she has led all aspects of its public efforts in the United States for the last decade. Libby Lenkinski is the host of The Forward's Make Art Not War podcast and a producer on films including Sabbath Queen, Coexistence My Ass, Holding Liat, and No Hope. She currently serves on the board of American Friends of the Batsheva Dance Company and is on the advisory committee for the Interagency Task Force on Israeli-Arab Issues, as well as Ayin Press, Schlepp Labs, and Diaspora Alliance. So let's find out what's next for this slumbering giant that was and will be Heeb. Mick Moore, Libby Lenkinski, welcome to Judaism Unbounded. So great to have you.
Great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So I wanted to start just with a little bit of grounding for our listeners in what Heeb was, as you say, back in the Bush administration. This is a time when I know that Lex was, I think, in utero, or perhaps, reading this.
That's not true.
Or, if he
That's
was reading...
deeply not true.
If he was reading Heeb, he had it inside of the volume of Talmud that he was supposed to be studying from in Hebrew school. And for me, it was part of my adult life, so we're a cross-generational, a multi-generational podcast. And so for those folks who don't really know the story of Heeb, I thought we could just start with telling us a little bit about what it was when it started.
Sure. Heeb was founded, the first issue came out, Heeb magazine was founded in 2002 by a woman named Jennifer Blyer, who had been a student at Columbia University. She was a zine sort of writer and publisher. In the Jewish world, she was known for a zine called Mazel Tov Cocktail. And so this was the mid 90s when she was, had come to New York, was at Columbia. And, in the late 90s into the early 2000s, I don't want to tell her story for her, but Jen and a group of folks got together and decided to create Heeb magazine as like a glossy zine in some ways. She had come out of the punk subculture, which I think had been both like a really important musical and cultural space, but also a political space in an era when magazines were really, really important for a lot of people and in some ways really prestigious places to work and to find really interesting ideas and articles. So Heeb was launched in 2002 with a premiere issue. And it published as a print magazine 22 issues over the next 8 years. So basically over the period of the 2000s, it was a print magazine, and then it went online only. And then in 2019, by 2019 had stopped publishing online. So that's the overarching trajectory of Heeb magazine. It wasn't only a magazine, though. It also was pretty famous for the events that it threw. Those included launch parties, comedy events. They did something called Heebanism. And, it was initially most famous because of the decision to choose Heeb as a name. Today, when I asked my kids who are college age if they know what Heeb means, they've never heard the word. But back in 2002, people knew that Heeb was an anti-Jewish slur. And there was a lot of sort of controversy from the older folks in the community that were not thrilled to see these upstarts trying to reclaim this anti-Semitic slur as sort of a point of, sort of Jewish pride. It was a Jewish culture and politics magazine, sort of satirical and subversive in nature, and occasionally getting into trouble with its parents.
So let's flash forward to now and what you're trying to do with Heeb. And I guess I have two questions. One is, what are you trying to do with Heeb? What's the next chapter? And the other is why did you want to do it with Heeb? And maybe that goes to the question of the name as well. I mean, that just as you said, Mick, the establishment of the name of Heeb was controversial in its time and was trying to do a certain thing, reclaiming a slur. I mean, I think of how the queer community took the word queer and turned it into a positive. And I guess I'm wondering if that is still something that you think about, or at this point, it's really just that it's a great IP and you're building its next chapter.
Well, I appreciate you saying that it's great IP, Dan, because that is not a small piece of it, right? I mean, I do think Heeb spent a long time as a magazine and as a community sort of establishing a brand that for a lot of people who remember it was a really important one. There's a constituency out there that remembers Heeb really fondly, that have told us that they miss the energy, the humor, the subversive streak, the willingness of Heeb to take risks, and in some ways like the sense of optimism, right, that Heeb had despite publishing in some really dark times. For those of us who remember the Bush years, those were were dark days. I think the question of
we're long past that, of course.
yes, exactly. We totally turned a corner on dark
Now
days.
now they
So
seem like sort of medium dark, just comparatively.
Are we talking coffee roasts right now? Like medium
Yes.
dark, dark? I
Yes.
like it.
We're now in like the espresso days.
I'd like to enter our hazelnut era. That would be my preference for our society.
I mean, but for real, I have very explicit memories of being around the dinner table and my dad just like railing against Dan Quayle for being the world's biggest idiot and like spelling potato wrong or whatever it was. And I was just in Israel visiting my parents, and I reminded my dad of that. Like, you remember how much you hated him? Now he seems like a Rhodes Scholar with spelling potato wrong. Sorry, continue.
yeah, no, I think we all have a similar memory of how our standards have fallen. But so there's that. So the IP, the memory, the memory of Heeb, the connection that many people felt with Heeb, I think is really still strong. And then, for new people for whom both the brand doesn't have a sort of built-in meaning, and many of whom the word no longer packs a punch the way it used to. We had a lot of conversations about whether or not that was enough of a reason to lose the name, change the name. And we decided that it made sense to keep it, that in some ways we're pocketing the gains, that have been made. In some ways, what they were trying to do with He, which is to turn it into this empowering word in the way that, as you said, Dan, queer has shifted, and that we don't need to stick our finger in the eyes of our parents in the same way that perhaps felt really necessary 25 years ago, even though I think the core subversive streak is still really important, and the willingness to take risks, which obviously the name in and of itself was an example of that.
I mean, at this point, our parents have cataracts, and so there's no need to stick our fingers in their eyes.
Yeah, it's my kids sticking their fingers in my eye.
Yes.
Exactly what I was going to say. Interesting that we're thinking about ourselves as the kids in this scenario, especially you, Mick. So I think I'm generationally right between you guys, Dan and Lex. So when he launched in 2002, I had already graduated from college, but just pretty recently. And before that, I had a very Jewish-only life. Like, I went to a Jewish day school in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Jewish summer camp, albeit very left-wing, kibbutz camp in the Catskills. And I was a rebellious, punky, hippie teenager. And so I was downtown Philadelphia a lot. And it was like there were kind of two worlds for me. There was my home base, which was not cool at all, but very Jewish. And then there was downtown, which was really grungy. I was really into zines and the grunge scene and the hip hop scene. And those things were not in any way connected for me. And then in college, I met non-Jews for the first time and sort of moved into a much more kind of secular world. When I lived in New York City and Heeb came out, it was like, oh, they're trying to do something that for me felt like I was the only one that occupied like those two things. In the broadest sense, like a sort of ancestry of irreverent Jewish subculture, Heeb was for me the kind of gateway to that. And I think it's part of building a positive, irreverent Jewish identity in America during these kinds of dark times, to also harken back to like a root of what that culture is. And now I have to say a quote that I literally use twice a day. 3,000 years of beautiful history from Moses to Sandy Koufax. You better believe I'm living in the past. Which
Big Lebowski.
The Big Lebowski, another irreverent
named
Jewish...
by Heeb as the best Jewish movie of all time. I was doing my research and saw that Heeb gave it that honor, which is richly deserved.
Richly deserved and very relevant to even the story of Heeb coming back now to offer content to irreverent, funny, sexy, punk rock Jewish identity in an era where we're really scared.
Yeah. I'll save my hot takes on the dude. That's for another time. But The Big Lebowski is very near and dear to my heart. I want to dwell in this, I would say, lineage piece you're bringing up. You use the phrase ancestry of irreverent subculture. I am really taken by the embrace Heeb has had, I mean, when it was released and now, of whether we call it like Gen X Jewish culture or like that rough age cohort of people who, as we speak now, are probably in their mid 40s through mid 50s. I mean, I'm throwing out approximations, but that feels about right. It's actually really an experience that I found meaningful to go to the Heeb website now as there's the relaunch. And right now, there's still actually a lot of stuff from 20 years ago. You sort of see a set of things from folks that are now, I hate to say it, because like seen as, not the edgy young folks. Like you see like an exhibition of what those people were bringing into the world when they were emerging adults. I think it brings up a lot of questions about age dynamics and points to some serious problems we have even among like Jewish progressives and the Jewish left. Like, I think there is a real antagonism towards elders sometimes, towards people who, and elders is like I don't know if like Heeb is on the borderline between elders and middlers, but like what I don't want to happen is for people to go to this site and be like, wow, that's cringe, because what it reflects is 20 years ago's forms of like engaging with Jewish culture. Like that's an experience that one could have, but it's so simplistic, and I find it actually a little bit disrespectful, because what y'all were and the role that you were serving and hopefully will be serving to folks in Gen X, Xennials, whatever, was so important. Libby, I love what you said. Like there was this media landscape that just palpably was not for people that were younger than like boomers. That's just not who it was for. And y'all stepped up and filled that gap. And I know that when it started, it wasn't specifically the two of you, but Heeb, the set of people, stepped up and filled that gap. And I believe that we should see Heeb as part of a lineage with things like Jewish Currents, which for me, firmly in the millennial generation, has come to feel that way to my age cohort. And I think it's actually a reflection that those of us who see Jewish Currents as like, wow, this thriving, new, beautiful representation of emerging Jewish left culture, like there's going to be a time where we're cringe too. We should be finding the ways to name and celebrate that which each of our generations is creating and seeing it as one general piece. And so I'd love to hear more about the Gen X piece. Like, to what degree do you really see your audience as like a particular age cohort? And to what degree are you trying to be for everybody beyond just folks in their 40s and 50s?
Yeah. So what we decided even before we relaunched was that we believe that Heeb can truly be a cross-generational space. And that, in fact, for it to be successful, it has to be. We did a small sort of pre-launch gathering, including a reasonable number of 20-somethings. And it was really interesting to, the older folks who remembered Heeb had the reactions that you would sort of expect. Like they were excited to see it back, and they remembered this piece, and we had old copies of the magazine out, and it's like, oh, that's me. I remember that interview. There was a nostalgia. For the young people, it was funny. This one of the people who was there works in fashion. He's 23, 24 years old. And he picked up old copies of the magazine, and he was looking through, looking at the fashion parts of it. And fashion was a pretty big part of what he was doing back then. And he said, this is really in right now. The way these photos are taken, what people are wearing, like what he was seeing was there's so much from that period that in fact resonates with him today. I think we have gone through, in my lifetime, there's a lot of that, every, few years, it's like, 20 years ago is now coming back, or 25 years, there's sort of that one generation lag. But the other thing that he said, and others did as well, was that there was just nothing like this today, the ways in which nothing like that existed now. It got these folks excited about the possibility of creating that anew. We're meeting with a lot of young people right now who are going to be part of building Heeb, and relying on them to figure out like who are the right people to be working with. Like if we're doing projects with creators on social media, like who are the creators to bring in to be part of the community that will connect with the younger audience. if we're developing original programming, what's the kind of original programming that would be exciting for a younger audience. So I think I will not feel like we've succeeded if all we've done is sort of brought the gang back together. And so far, I'm optimistic that the Gen Z folks will take a hold of Heeb and make it their own.
I want to say about the age and generational thing, because Lex, you mentioned Jewish Currents as like a sort of counterpoint, a magazine that I was also on the board of for a few years. And, it's interesting that Jewish Currents is seen as like a new, young, thriving magazine where it also is, it's a legacy magazine that my commie grandpa, my Zadie, read. I mean, I think there's something really interesting there. And I think it also reflects on what might be possible for Heeb, differentiated actually from a Jewish Currents. And I'm now going to talk about the elephant in every room. I'm going to talk about it also because my logo of the arts and culture organization that I recently founded is an elephant, because it is entirely focused on Israel-Palestine. And I think bringing it up here because the sort of common discourse in the American Jewish community is that is the crux of the generational divides. And we recently did a study of 20 focus groups of what's typically thought of as unaffiliated and disaffiliated young American Jews across the country under the age of 40. Unaffiliated are people who have never really been served by Jewish communal institutions. Either they live geographically in a place that doesn't have, a JCC or synagogues or whatever, or for whatever other reason, they've sort of never been involved. And then disaffiliated are people who have left. According to many studies, that's about 70% of American Jews under the age of 40. And so we recently did a set of 20 focus groups to try to understand what media they're consuming about Israel-Palestine and why. And the findings were quite interesting as they relate to Heeb, and it'll tie back to Jewish Currents as well. We talked to people across political affiliations, across Jewish affiliations, very diverse gender, race, and geography-wise, also age-wise, like all the way down to early college and all the way up to age 40. And the findings were that there's this subset, a minority, that are self-identified Republicans who have no ambivalence about Israel and Zionism publicly or privately, have a lot of pride in Judaism and are willing to vocalize that and like wear a Star of David or walk with the flag of Israel. Like I think of those as like the Jewish frat boys on campus. Then there's like this vast majority who are self-identified Democrat, who vary tremendously in terms of their comfort level with the word Zionism or anti-Zionism and will not use them publicly, are generally speaking critical of Israel's actions, are very ambivalent about their Jewish identity. And then there's this like interesting other subgroup, which is also a minority, who are self-identified Democrats or independent, are very comfortable with no ambivalence about anti-Zionism, also publicly, and are critical of Israel's actions and have big pride in Jewish identity. I call these the watermelon kippas. I think that Jewish Currents has been very powerful and successful at bringing together through the publication that subset and really making it okay to feel proud of your Jewish identity outwardly and be vehemently anti-Zionist. What we're thinking about is the full range, and in particular, those people under 40 who are in that, what we would like to call mushy middle. My understanding of that group is that there is not a lot of content there. There's a lot of conflict there, but there's not a lot to like grasp onto. I feel like Jewish Currents gave the watermelon kippas some language and some ideology and some culture to grasp onto. The mushy middle is like not grasping on to traditional media outlets, like Jewish media outlets. They're not grasping on to Jewish Currents because of the overtness and the sort of driving of the anti-Zionist narrative through subculture and pop culture. I think there's a lot that we can do. I mean, there was this sense that everything is very agendaed, everything has a logo on it. You can't trust that it's the real fact. It feels like people are trying to drive you towards a particular point of view, and people just like want to know what actually happened. But I think the interesting thing for us is the desire that we heard in the focus group for real, authentic stories from the ground, which isn't analysis, it isn't narrative, it's stories, real people's real stories. And I think, Mick and I are thinking a lot about what that looks like in the context of Heeb, which is an American publication trying to reach really this 70% and not trying to beat around the bush when it comes to Israel Palestine, but also not trying to like drive something so particular.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, on a number of fronts. First, I want to just highlight an earlier piece that Libby, you brought around Jewish currents actually not just being a millennial thing and being this reflection of much earlier times. I think there's something really fascinating happening that it's only 2 examples, so you can't yet call it like a trend, I don't know. But the pass-off of Jewish currents from firmly boomers, and I mean specifically that actual generation, not boomers as like an overarching term for old people, like boomers in New York State as much as New York City, to millennials. Like that was a conscious effort at Jewish Currents. And I was actually part of some of the focus groups and things that they did at that point. And then what we're seeing with Heeb sounds kind of similar. I mean, the Gen X is still firmly involved, but there is like a Gen X, Gen Z partnership going on. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense because it's not across the board true, but like a lot of boomers who have children, their children are millennials. A lot of Gen Xers who have children, their children are Gen Z. And so there is a real like deep human desire for people to be able to connect to their kids. And so that's happening in Jewish media. And like I'd like us to notice that part of the story because I think it's interesting. The thing I want to ask about does relate to the name Heeb. And you hinted at this, that like that was controversial at the time. I think that if this was the first launch of Heeb, was not a relaunch, but a first launch, I don't think too many people would lose sleep over it. There have been so many things, Jewishly and beyond, that have sort of taken the tack of, we're going to call ourselves the provocative thing, we're going to call ourselves the taboo thing, because we actually want to reclaim it or we want to do something with that. Like, that's become a very common strategy. I don't mean to poo-poo it or say it's not a good strategy, but like, just in Jewish media, we have, a successful podcast that ended a few years ago called Treif, the word for not kosher. We have Protocols, which is a shout out to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That was what I think maybe still exists, but like was a sort of arts and culture and intellectual Jewish online publication. Even us, we feature classes where we're trying to find the positive sides of folks in Jewish history, like Shabbatai Tzvi, who is seen as like the bad guy, or we've got groups that are re-embracing Korach, a villain in the Bible. Like all of this, we're going to take that word that you use as an insult or that figure that you don't like, that's actually going to be a good thing now. Seems to be more common. I don't want to over-intellectualize too much, but I think there's something to point at movies like Wicked, at postmodernism, at like this practice of finding the bad folks in an original story and then shifting it, that is influencing that. Can you talk to us more about the name Heeb, maybe then and now?
I mean, I would agree with the analysis, and I including your opening statement in that if Heeb were founded today and chose the name, that it would not set off alarm bells. The sensibilities of, the people in charge, quote unquote, are very different today than they were a generation ago. So, I mean, I think it's a fair observation. I also think you're correct in that lots of people have done it, which has taken some of the bite out of it, which is to say they've done it and the world, the sky hasn't fallen, as it were. There was a confidence in the 2000s that the American Jewish community had that, like, anti-Semitism had sort of been defeated. It was post-Cold War, right? Like there was this sort of moment where I think a lot of folks from this generation felt like we had overcome it, and that our parents' and grandparents' decision to center anti-Semitism was an old-fashioned way of thinking. It wasn't dealing with the real world we lived in, et cetera, et cetera. At least I remember feeling that, and I knew a lot of other people my age who did. And, we're in this moment where I think there's a pretty wide consensus that overt anti-Semitism is back in a way that a lot of people hadn't ever experienced before. I would say the community has probably very different opinions about the locus of that anti-Semitism, but I think there's fairly wide agreement that we are seeing overt acts of anti-Semitism. And so in some ways, even while the word Heeb may have sort of gone out of favor as like a slur against Jews, the fact that there are slurs being used or, arm gestures or other things.
I was just going to say, it's not subtle. Yeah, the moment is totally different. Like when I graduated from college, I absolutely thought that anti-Semitism was over, except for in like the darkest corners of the like far right KKK. But I just wasn't worried about it at all. I now am like, Elon Musk hailed Hitler at the inauguration. And I'm pretty sure that when they start deporting us, Jonathan Greenblatt is going to open the door to the Tesla that drives me away to Canada. The house is on fire for Jews. And yes, it's not only coming from one locus, but that locus is in the White House. So when we're using the name Heeb, we're adding our name to a registry of Jews in this country. That's not what Jen Blyer was doing in 2002. She was doing a punk rock thing. And it is punk rock still, but there's real stakes attached to it. I mean, we're deporting people.
Yeah, I would just say, in addition, I think what people were looking for then and are looking for again now is a way into a community that is still able to approach this reality with a genuine subversive streak, right? With humor, with some amount of optimism, despite all of this reality that's around us, and that's willing to take risks at a time when taking risks is really scary to people.
I think it's about heroes. And I dare these Zoomers to point at Adam Yauch, Zichrono Livracha, may he rest in peace and power, and call him cringy.
Wait for this. If the Zoomers don't know who he is, you want to say another word?
The original Beastie Boy was on the cover of Heeb magazine, and who, beyond being a badass hip hop punk rapper, was also the driving force behind the Free Tibet concerts, Free Darfur initiatives that brought in tons of celebrities, little bands like U2 and REM alongside the Beastie Boys, standing up for decolonizing and freeing Tibet. In fact, I just saw a clip of Yauch talking in 1992 at a Grammy Awards about peace in the Middle East, before it was cool to be doing so. So I dare those youngins to point to him and call him cringe. And I do think that one of the roles that he played then and can play now is identifying who the contemporary Jewish heroes are based on the kind of cultural subversiveness and risk-taking that so many of us are struggling to find.
Let's talk about that further, both in terms of the deep substance of what you're talking about and also just the kind of what's Heeb going to do. When you go to the Heeb website now, heebmedia.com, you can read back issues of Heeb, articles from back issues of Heeb. You can get some cool merch. So for our audience who listens to this episode and rushes right over there to look at this stuff, I think they're going to have a great experience. For some of us, it's a blast from the past or a time machine experience, which I have so been enjoying. And for others, it's going to be an introduction to some really awesome stuff that happened a decade or two ago. But what's coming next? I'm really interested in both the style, is it going to be a magazine or is it going to be other materials? And also just to pursue, Libby, what you started talking about when you were talking about Israel-Palestine and the idea that what is the content going to be? Is it going to be celebrities? Is it going to be, Adam Yauch type celebrities who, maybe we initially are drawn to because we love their music, but then it turns out that they're also an important moral voice? And or is it going to be what maybe one might call a more, quote, serious, that it's going to be dispatches from the ground from Israel, with real stories, or from Palestine? Or when we think about that it's not about Israel-Palestine, that we're thinking about what is our life here in in America or elsewhere in the diaspora, that it's like Jewish learning. I mean, what might it be that would be real? What's this new landscape that you imagine is going to create that thing that I'm really excited about, this notion that, right, because culture is about heroes and villains and stories, and that seems to be pretty missing from the Jewish landscape across the board, except perhaps on those extremes of both ends. Who are the heroes for? I don't like to call it the mushy middle because for me, as a denizen of this area, I don't feel it's mushy. I feel there's something really there, but I have trouble articulating it, all the more so people who are not thinking about it every day, because we don't have those stories. We don't have those heroes. People laugh about it and say, our hero is going to be somebody who says, well, it could be either way. But that's not the hero that we're looking for. The heroes that we're looking for are people who are thoughtful. I mean, I always think about the story from the Talmud about the dispute between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and the voice of God comes and says that they both represent the words of God, but we follow the path of Hillel. So that's not mushy. That's saying that there is truth, there's importance of diversity of opinions, and yet we can choose a path.
This question of who are the heroes, who are the sort of cultural heroes of today, I think we are going to be entering into a process of discovery, right? And what was great about Heeb back in the day is that you would open an issue and you might see, oh, there's this celebrity, I recognize them, next to 5 people you've never heard of. Right? Or who maybe you heard of, but you didn't even think they had a Jewish story to tell. And, when one of them is a graffiti artist and another one is in fashion and another one is is an activist, and right, all of them sort of sat side by side. And so that's the process that we're, engaging in now. We didn't talk very much about our backgrounds earlier, but I run a creative agency and have for 14 years. And a lot of my work is in comedy. And for the last 6 years, I've helped run a program it's a comedy fellowship program. And I have, through my work, met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comedians that people have never heard of, right? Who are not famous comedians, but who are doing really interesting cutting edge work. Another really important piece of this is the fact that we're actually really interested in non-Jews as an audience as well. And so when we think about the people that we're describing as Jewish heroes, we are insistent that there are many Jewish artists and creators that non-Jews are really interested in learning about and experiencing and following, and that there are just not enough spaces where they can find them and that are interested in reaching them as an audience. And he was always really intentional about reaching non-Jews and seeing non-Jews as an important audience. And so that's another piece of the legacy that we're going to bring forward with us.
To the question about audience and non-Jewish audiences for this, about a decade ago, I co-founded the Israeli MoveOn.org. It's called Zazim. And in the research leading up to it, I learned that after MoveOn.org launched, which was around the time of the Clinton impeachment, there started to be like spin-off groups that came out of MoveOn that were more particular in the type of identity that they were trying to reach. Color of Change came about by African Americans for African Americans with issues that African Americans care about. There was Ultraviolet, which was the feminist one. Faithful America, which was the sort of Christian liberal one. And when I talked to all those people, all those founders, I found out that actually their lists were about half the identity group that they were flagshipping and about half everyone else. And I realized that it actually resonated with me because as an American Jew, I had joined Faithful America because I wanted to hear what liberal Christians were saying about what was going on because I was surprised that such a thing even existed. And I think that's like an interesting lens around audience when it comes to something that is trying to flagship a particular identity, American Jews, but trying to reach beyond it. I think it's very possible to do that. I think it's actually very likely that that will happen. And I think one of the key questions or one of the key kind of content aspects, it's who are our contemporary Jewish heroes, but it's also like, who are our rabbis in the broadest sense of the term? Like, who are the luminaries that are most relevant to us? I am lucky because I have two rabbis who are actual rabbis. What defines them is a sort of non-binariness about the world. So my actual rabbi, Amichai Levi, the Sabbath Queen.
Recent guest, check the show notes for Amichai's recent appearance.
Yes, and he is just wonderful. And my other one, Sharon Brous in LA, is also very both and-ish in her approach to the world. I assume she's been on the show as well.
Less recent, but recent guest. See the show notes.
So they are actual rabbis who I can say are my rabbis, and are also extremely popular in the media, on social media. But I think that the non-binariness of it is essential, because one of the things that differentiates the younger generations, and I include all of us among them, as compared to the older generations of our grandparents, is that our Judaism isn't the totality of who we are in America. It isn't the totality of what we want from our lives in America. It can be a lens, but it's always a both and. And Rabbi Sharon talks about Jews as edge people. We're always sort of on the edges. Leaning into that in terms of content, in terms of who the creators are, feels like a very relevant and resonant approach right now. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how far we can reach when also the Israeli and Palestinian creators are not the usual suspects and are irreverent and are non-binary, not necessarily in the gender sense, but in their approach to the world.
Yeah. So many beautiful bits of, I would say, Torah there. And one of them, I want to just shout out, like, it is appropriate and great that two people representing an organization called Heeb, which, if we're going to tell the full origin story of the word Heeb, which comes from Hebrew, which comes from the Hebrew word Ivri or Ivrim, in the Bible, it seems that the word Ivrim, Hebrews, is chosen because it relates to being on the precipice between two things, to being a crosser of boundaries. Avar, the root of Ivrim, is to cross or transgress. And so what you're saying about non-binariness feels like a very natural outgrowth of something that would call itself Heeb. I don't know that that was the intent behind choosing the name Heeb, but I, as part of an organization, Judaism Unbound, that has found many meanings for our name that we did not notice at first, I hope that that can make its way into Heeb's self-identity as well. I also want to shout, like, people have rebbes, have rabbis. I love, Libby, that you're just like naming, these are my two rabbis. I think it's so important to have that. I have a list of I call them rebbes, less so rabbis. One of them, Natasha Leone, is actually an interviewee of Heeb back in the day. I was reading the piece. It was the talk about an incredible time capsule. She has shifted and changed and grown in her like explicit Jewish content a lot. I want to talk about the binary that is fake of culture and religion, or maybe in another form, Torah versus Delhi. Jews interested in Miriam from the story of Exodus versus Jews interested in Babs from Streisand. I'm giving as many formulations as I can. I think we have operated with this segmentation between things that are quote unquote secular and quote unquote religious for a really long time. And it's interesting that we were talking about Jewish currents before, because I think they've been navigating as historically something that calls itself secularist. They now have like commentaries on the Torah portion regularly. And that's upset some of their longtime people. It's also brought a lot of joy to other people. But in Jewish media, we're seeing a lot of blurring there. And I'd even say in not just like Jewish publications that think of themselves that way, but like shows on Netflix that feature Jewish stuff. Like we have things that are focused on Shivas, on, memorializing people's death, that are like widely circulated movies. Whereas a few decades ago, like Seinfeld didn't even want to say directly that its characters were Jewish.
Shtisel, we call that Shtisselmania, Lex.
Yes, Shtisselmania. Like, I think there's something really powerful and interesting happening on that front. And I'm also curious, like, how Heeb is looking to position itself there. It may sort of be figured out as you're going, but I'm curious where you would articulate it now. Like, if somebody were to ask you, well, are you a cultural publication or are you a religious publication? Like, I would hate that question, but I think people ask it sometimes. Do you see yourselves as sort of actively blurring that positionality? Do you see yourselves more on the culture or pop culture side? Historically, like I mentioned, it was interviewing actors, and like there were things that I think would feel to people more like the cultural side than the religious side. And I believe that there is religious meaning to be found even in the pop culture side. So like, I guess I'd just love to hear from you about that fake binary that people operate with of secular versus religious, culture versus religion. How does Heeb conceptualize that, and how are you looking to sort of have that influence your content?
I'll start by saying the episode of the Jewish Currents podcast where they had the old timers on against the newer folks, and they were debating this question of, whether or not it was completely inappropriate for Jewish Currents to be featuring, Torah commentary, is my all-time favorite episode. It really helped to underscore this radical shift in mindset where a couple generations earlier, in particular, on the left, there was this incredible fear of religion as a genuinely dangerous thing that the left needed to avoid at all costs, and that the left today, at least this part of it, doesn't have that same fear. That it's I would say, an open question for Heeb, how we're going to think about the relationship between, these two sort of worlds, the sort of religion versus culture. To take a step back slightly, religion is part of culture, as opposed to religion being opposed to culture. And in the Jewish community, you'll often have somebody say, oh, I identify as a cultural Jew. And what they mean is, I don't identify with religion. And so they've set those two things in opposition to one another. But broadly speaking, religion sits within culture. It includes ritual, it includes music, it includes
sports, food.
Well, yeah, and all these other things. But even just within a religious context, you have all these sort of other elements. And so I think the Jewish community, because there is so much drama over the last few hundred years in trying to figure out the what are we question, that culture has become a sort of way of signaling a particular identity that is sort of either hostile to or at least separate from religious identity, which has taken on a particular meaning. So I think those lines today feel a lot blurrier than maybe they have in the past. But I don't think Heeb has resolved the question of sort of how we'll approach that. And I think one of the things we're excited about, in part with these intergenerational conversations, is to get a sense of, some of the things that really resonate for Gen Z, and, and what they look to, and the way in which those lines are either blurry or not for them. So feels like an unsatisfying answer, but a real one. I think it's a question that we're going to be figuring out.
I think that what you just said about rebbes that are not rabbis, I really, really have that too. One of my real rebbes is an Israeli artist named Netta Weiner, who founded the band System Ali and has recently been teaching at Tufts in Boston and founded another band, wait for it, Ois to Men. And I've always said that for me, there are 3 Torahs that I have known as texts that define my Judaism. One is the capital T Torah. Another is Angels in America by Rebbe Tony Kushner. And the third is Into the Woods by Reb Stephen Sondheim. Zichrono livracha, may he rest in peace. I never really understood myself what I meant by that when I would say it. But in recent years, I've made friends with 2 Jewish historians, one named Tony Michaels at University of Wisconsin and one David Myers from UCLA, who both really expand in their scholarship the idea of the Jewish canon, where, yes, there's the Torah and our sort of traditional religious Jewish texts that deserve the close study that many of us have done at different points in our lives. But then there are so many other Jewish texts, whether it's from philosophy or psychoanalysis, or whether it's from contemporary pop culture, from Broadway, that also deserve close text study. The binary that you talked about between culture and religion has just never been true. And it might be, I've never lived in that binary, maybe because my family is so secular. My mom is a kibbutznik. She never saw the inside of a synagogue until we were at Solomon Schechter, and she was in her 30s. And my dad grew up in a Buddhist house in Toronto where they were pretty Marxist and anti-religious. He too, knew nothing about the religious side of things until my sister and I were at Schechter. And they learned that through us. But we had a lot of Judaism. That was never a question. I only knew Jews. Many of them were Israelis. That was the air I breathed. That was the culture I breathed. And so I think today it's all kind of a continuum of culture. As Mick was saying, religion is in it, and so are so many other things. I go back to 3,000 years of beautiful history from Moses, from the capital T Torah, to Sandy Koufax from baseball, you know?
Oh, shkoyach.
All right. So as we close here, I'm thinking about the year 2048 or so, when a bunch of listeners out there who are perhaps in their 20s or 30s are reviving Heeb for the second time. And I would love for you to describe a little bit about the world that, if you are as successful as you imagine being, I suppose if you're as successful as you imagine being, Heeb won't need to be revived a second time. But just for the sake of the question, how is the world different because you've done what you've done, and what's going on, and what had Heeb been in those years?
So I'll start by saying I think it's important, and something I've learned as I've gotten older, to not feel like things that shut down were failures. So I definitely didn't take the hypothetical that Heeb is being revived to signal that that would have meant it had failed. I think Heeb magazine, as a published magazine, was around for 8 years. And I think those were incredibly successful years. Heeb was successful, even though it didn't last forever. Which is to say, if you did something worthwhile enough that people later want to revive it, that's always a good sign. Substantively, I'll say, there was a bit of a snowball effect the first time round, which is that as projects like Heeb got off the ground, they provided sort of inspiration and to some degree some scaffolding for other entities to do the same. So one of the ones that we like to cite that appeared a year later and whose sort of timeline was pretty similar was J-Dub Records. And J-Dub Records, didn't last forever, but in part, I think because he was around, it was a space that was interested in what J-Dub Records was doing, with the artists that were coming out that they were finding and that they were, whose albums they were putting out. What happens is you begin to create more and more space for other, whether it's individual creators or new projects, to rise up and to find an audience and to gain popularity. So I think there's the individual success of Heeb in terms of, we have goals around, we want 10 million followers across our social platforms, and, we want to have a show that starts as an online show that we can actually move into a network or a streaming platform. There are those kinds of ambitions where, you begin to see the kinds of people who are discovered through Heeb, then becoming, right, sort of part of the firmament of American Jewish culture. But I think in some ways more broadly that if this can start a revival, right, for these kinds of independent, risk-taking, creative voices, that will be success in my mind.
My 2048 by Libby Lenkinski. In 2048, I want to think that the world looks like full equality for all people living on the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. A far less complicated and much more positive diasporic Jewish identity. And what that looks like for us is a content-rich proud diasporic identity that's full of language and music and food and friends and community, where Jews come out to celebrate and be together, not only because of moments of crisis, like Tree of Life or like Gaza, but what Heeb can do towards that. Well, I think Mick and I and many of our colleagues believe that culture is a driver, if not the most important driver of social and political change. I think there's evidence of that being true across very, very brutal conflicts around the world. And so Heeb and the ecosystem of non-binary Jewish cultural pursuits are going to pave the way for that kind of image to catch on with the 10 million readers and viewers. And my hope is that that inspires the political and social changes necessary for that to be our reality. And may it be so.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much for having us. This was really, really fun.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, Dan mentioned it at the top, but we've got Shavuot, our biggest festival of the year, where we gather for 24 hours consecutively in Zoom. You don't have to come the whole time, but you can. You can also come for 1 hour, 3 hours, whatever you want. Shavuot Live is coming up. You can register at judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's SHAVUOT. Don't miss it. You want to learn with some incredible luminaries, rabbis, scholars, activists, everyday Jews like you. It's a really sensational time. We hope to see you there. We also hope that, of course, you'll be in touch with us with any questions, ideas, visions, comments that you have about this episode or our others. And you can always do that in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also deeply grateful if you're able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring donation or via a one-time gift. And you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.